On the morning of January 20th, 1953, a quiet tension settled over Washington, D.C. The sky hung low and gray at 49 degrees, one of those heavy winter mornings where the cold feels personal. Outside the north portico of the White House, a long black limousine idled in silence. Inside it sat President-elect Dwight David Eisenhower, stiff-jawed and unwavering. He refused to step out. He refused to enter the residence. The soon-to-be leader of the free world had made a choice. He would not walk through that door to greet the outgoing president. Inside the executive mansion, Harry S. Truman stood by a window, staring at the unmoving vehicle. This was supposed to be a morning of unity, a ritual older than both men, symbolizing continuity and grace. Truman knew the customs. The president-elect enters the White House, shares coffee with the outgoing couple, then both ride together to the Capitol. Instead, Eisenhower's refusal turned the quiet halls into a stage for humiliation. This was no scheduling mishap, no crossed wires, no innocent misunderstanding. Eisenhower's refusal was a deliberate break with tradition, a cold symbolic strike delivered on a day meant to showcase dignity. The irony was staggering. The man in the car, victor of Europe, commander of millions, the most admired American general since Grant, now refused to take 20 steps to shake Truman's hand. Truman had once admired Eisenhower deeply. He had praised him in public speeches, defended him in private conversations, and even envisioned a future where the general would lead the nation, possibly with Truman himself stepping aside. But the bond that once held them together had cracked over years of political clashes, personal disappointments, and one unforgivable moment that Truman never let go. Now, that broken trust was visible for the entire world to see. The limousine remained still. Truman knew Eisenhower wasn't coming inside, and for a brief moment, it seemed the standoff could derail the ceremony itself. Two men so anchored in stubborn pride that the peaceful transfer of power might freeze over. But Truman, for all his frustration, still respected the office. He walked outside, stepped toward the car, and forced history to move forward. But this cold confrontation didn't begin that morning. It began years earlier on a ruined road outside Berlin, when a single sentence planted the seed of a political fracture that would one day shake the presidency. The rift between Truman and Eisenhower did not erupt suddenly in 1953. Its origins stretched back to July 1945, in the fragile months following World War II. In the shattered remains of Berlin, surrounded by the skeletal ruins of a defeated empire, President Truman rode beside General Dwight Eisenhower along a broken autobahn. Truman, new to the presidency and still carrying the weight of Roosevelt's legacy, saw in Eisenhower something he believed America desperately needed. A steady hand, a symbol of victory, a leader forged by crisis. As they traveled through the wreckage, Truman made an extraordinary offer, one rarely spoken aloud in American history. He told Eisenhower that if the general ever wanted to pursue political office, Truman would help him reach it. Anything he desired, Truman said, he would try to make possible. It wasn't flattery. It wasn't theatrics. Truman genuinely believed Eisenhower could be the next great American statesman, the kind of unifying figure the nation craved after years of war. Truman even told close advisors, privately, that if Eisenhower wanted the presidency in 1948, he would step aside. That's how highly he thought of Eisenhower's integrity and leadership. Truman had inherited the presidency abruptly, with little preparation and enormous global responsibilities. He respected Eisenhower not only as a general but as a symbol of competence and stability. Yet Eisenhower firmly declined the idea. He insisted he was a soldier, not a politician. For a time, their relationship flourished within that clear boundary. Truman offered Eisenhower powerful roles: Army Chief of Staff, then NATO's first Supreme Commander. Eisenhower accepted, serving with the same discipline and clarity that had defined his wartime leadership. Their letters were respectful, their meetings productive. Truman awarded Eisenhower multiple Distinguished Service Medals. They weren't friends, but they were reliable allies. Two men aligned in purpose if not in personality. But beneath the surface, a tension quietly formed. When Truman renewed the offer again in 1947, this time explicitly stating he would run as Eisenhower's vice president. Eisenhower once more refused. Truman accepted the rejection, but the thought lingered. Why did so many people insist Eisenhower enter politics if he truly had no interest? Why did Eisenhower always decline in ways that left uncertainty instead of finality? That ambiguity became the first hairline fracture in their trust. And that fracture widened dramatically when Eisenhower made a choice Truman never saw coming. He entered politics after all, but not on Truman's side. In the years after World War II, Truman and Eisenhower continued to work together, each relying on the other's strengths. Truman needed Eisenhower's unparalleled military judgment, and Eisenhower needed Truman's political support as he transitioned into post-war roles. But everything changed in 1952. Eisenhower, after years of insisting he had no political ambitions, suddenly announced he would seek the Republican nomination for president. For Truman, it was less a political surprise and more a personal blow, because if Eisenhower truly never wanted power, why now? And why with Truman's political rivals? Truman had offered Eisenhower the presidency twice, once verbally, once privately in his diary. He had even been willing to run as Eisenhower's vice president, a nearly unheard-of gesture from a sitting president. To Truman, these offers were acts of trust. But Eisenhower turned them all down, presenting himself as a loyal soldier uninterested in politics. So when he entered the race as a Republican, Truman felt deceived. Eisenhower didn't reject politics, he just rejected Truman's politics. Still, political disagreements could have been forgiven. Truman was no stranger to partisan battles. What he couldn't accept, what permanently broke their relationship, was what happened next. Eisenhower's campaign collided with a storm of accusations led by Senator Joseph McCarthy, whose crusade against supposed communists had already destroyed careers across the government. McCarthy and his allies targeted one man in particular, George C. Marshall, Eisenhower's mentor, Truman's trusted advisor, and one of the greatest architects of Allied victory. McCarthy accused Marshall of treason, conspiracy, and deliberately aiding communism. Wild claims with no evidence. Truman defended Marshall fiercely, calling him the greatest living American. Eisenhower, however, was silent. Worse, he campaigned alongside McCarthy and other senators who had insulted Marshall in the most grotesque terms. Truman saw Eisenhower's silence not as politics, but as disloyalty, an abandonment of the very man who had shaped Eisenhower's career from obscurity to global command. For Truman, the silence hurt more than a direct attack. He believed in loyalty as a moral obligation, not a political calculation. Truman was a man who stood by those who stood by him. When Eisenhower refused to defend Marshall, his mentor, his benefactor, his wartime guardian, it felt like a betrayal that reached far deeper than campaign rhetoric. It was a revelation about character, and Truman never forgot it. But the real breaking point was still ahead. A moment on a brightly lit stage in Milwaukee, when Eisenhower made a single decision that Truman considered unforgivable. By the fall of 1952, the presidential campaign was reaching a fever pitch. Dwight Eisenhower, war hero, national icon, symbol of American victory, was drawing enormous crowds everywhere he went. And in Wisconsin, the political landscape belonged to one man, Senator Joseph McCarthy, the architect of a fear-fueled crusade against suspected communists. Eisenhower's team prepared a speech for Milwaukee that included a powerful defense of George Marshall, the man McCarthy had slandered as a traitor. That single paragraph could have changed the tone of the campaign. It could have shown loyalty, courage, gratitude. In the original draft, Eisenhower declared that Marshall was one of the finest patriots he had ever known. Reporters had already received advance copies. The press expected a dramatic confrontation. Eisenhower standing on McCarthy's home turf, defending the man who had lifted him from a little-known officer to supreme commander of Allied forces. It was set to be the defining moral moment of the campaign. But then, political pressure tightened like a vice. Wisconsin's Republican leaders warned Eisenhower that criticizing McCarthy would cost him the state. They argued Marshall's honor could wait until after the election. Winning came first. A few advisors insisted the paragraph was unnecessary drama. And slowly, under the weight of polling numbers and party expectations, Eisenhower folded. He removed the lines defending Marshall. On October 3, 1952, Eisenhower walked onto the stage of the Milwaukee Arena. 10,000 people erupted in applause. McCarthy stood beside him grinning, basking in the cheering crowd. And Eisenhower, knowing exactly what had been erased, gave his speech without uttering a single word in Marshall's defense. Not a sentence, not a phrase, not even the man's name. For Truman, who learned about the removal from reporters, this was the deepest cut of all. And then came the photograph. After the speech, McCarthy lunged toward Eisenhower, clamping onto his hand and hoisting it into the air like a prizefighter claiming victory. Eisenhower tried to pull back, but the moment was captured by cameras from every angle. The next morning, Americans woke to front-page images of the D-Day commander smiling, however reluctantly, beside the man who had smeared George Marshall as a traitor. To Truman, it wasn't strategy. It wasn't necessity. It was betrayal made visible. Truman's fury exploded, but the campaign had only just begun. Because days later, Eisenhower made another choice, this time in Indiana, that would push Truman from anger to open contempt. Just 2 weeks after Milwaukee, the Eisenhower campaign made another stop, this time in Indianapolis, Indiana. If Wisconsin had been McCarthy's territory, Indiana was dominated by Senator William Jenner, a man whose attacks on George Marshall were even more vicious. Jenner had called Marshall a frontman for traitors, accused him of aiding America's enemies, and painted him as the architect of national decline. These weren't policy disagreements, they were character assassinations. And Eisenhower knew exactly what Jenner had said. Advisors warned Eisenhower that Jenner controlled a powerful faction within the Indiana Republican Party. Without Jenner's blessing, winning Indiana would be difficult. Every strategist repeated the same line. Just get through the event. Don't pick a fight. Don't challenge him. Smile, shake hands, and move on. Eisenhower, still trying to balance principle with political survival, agreed once again to silence. He would share the stage with Jenner, even though Jenner had accused Marshall, Eisenhower's mentor, of treasonous conspiracy. On the Indianapolis stage, Jenner greeted Eisenhower with a beaming smile. The cameras rolled as Jenner wrapped an arm around him, pulling him close for the photographers. Eisenhower, ever disciplined, returned the gesture with a polite smile. The crowd roared. Flashbulbs lit the night. And once again, Eisenhower said nothing to defend the man who had built the very career that led him to that stage. Later, aides would recall that Eisenhower felt uncomfortable and dirty after the event. But public silence carried more weight than private regret. To Truman, this moment crossed a moral boundary. In Milwaukee, Eisenhower had at least intended to defend Marshall before backing down. But in Indianapolis, he did not even attempt it. He simply shared a stage with the man who had hurled the most venomous insults at Marshall's loyalty and Truman's own administration. It wasn't political pragmatism, it was surrender. Truman believed that a man unwilling to defend the person who lifted him into greatness could not be trusted to defend the nation under real pressure. From that moment on, Truman stopped seeing Eisenhower as a reluctant politician caught in a partisan storm. Instead, he saw him as a man willing to let others be humiliated so he could win votes. The respect that once existed between them began dissolving into something colder: bitterness, disappointment, even contempt. What had once been a partnership was now a simmering conflict, waiting to erupt as the election approached. And when the campaign reached its final stretch, Truman struck back, publicly, fiercely, and without restraint. The transition to power was about to become one of the most hostile in American history. By late October 1952, the presidential campaign had transformed from a political contest into a personal duel. Truman, usually blunt but controlled, abandoned restraint. He believed Eisenhower's refusal to defend Marshall revealed a flaw deeper than policy differences. It hinted at weakness of character. So Truman took the gloves off. At every stop, in every speech, he held nothing back. The president accused Eisenhower of lacking courage, of failing the simplest test of loyalty, of standing beside men who smeared national heroes for political gain. Newspapers reported Truman's remarks with shock. The sitting president declared publicly that Eisenhower had stooped lower than I thought a man could stoop. He accused the general of letting political opportunists manipulate him. For Truman, these weren't rhetorical attacks. They were statements of moral outrage. He saw the election not just as a battle of ideas, but as a reckoning over integrity. And he used Marshall's name like a moral lightning bolt, reminding audiences that Eisenhower owed his entire career to the man he refused to defend. Eisenhower, for his part, felt personally wounded. He believed Truman was weaponizing Marshall's reputation for political advantage, turning a revered figure into a campaign prop. Eisenhower saw himself as the injured party, the man being slandered by a desperate incumbent clinging to power. In private, he seethed. He told advisers that Truman's comments crossed all boundaries of decency. And instead of reflecting on Truman's criticism, Eisenhower hardened. He saw the president not as a former ally but as an enemy. The two men could no longer hide their feelings. At rallies, Truman mocked Eisenhower as the puppet of Wall Street and the political establishment. Eisenhower responded by implying that the Truman administration was corrupt, incompetent, and responsible for the Korean stalemate. The campaign became a cascade of personal jabs, accusation layered upon accusation. A gulf widened between them, one that dignity, ceremony, and patriotism would not easily bridge. Yet beneath the rhetoric, both men still carried private doubts about how this feud would shape the transition of power. Eisenhower told close allies that he dreaded the first meeting with Truman after the election. Truman confided to staff that he no longer knew if Eisenhower respected the office at all. By November, the atmosphere was so hostile that even neutral observers sensed the inauguration would be unlike any before it. And then Election Day came, ushering in a victory so decisive that it forced both men to confront the uncomfortable reality of working together during the transition. Election Day arrived on November 4, 1952, and the results were overwhelming. Dwight Eisenhower swept the country with 442 electoral votes and 55% of the popular vote. From coast to coast, Americans celebrated the return of a national war hero to the spotlight, not as a general this time, but as the incoming president. But beneath the fireworks and applause, a question lingered like smoke. How would Eisenhower and Truman face each other after months of bitterness? Protocol demanded that the outgoing president meet with the president-elect. On November 18th, that moment arrived. Eisenhower walked into the White House, not as Truman's guest but as his successor. And both men knew they were stepping into a room heavy with unspoken grievances. Truman sat behind the resolute desk while Eisenhower took the seat across from him. Their handshake was stiff. Their expressions were grim. This wasn't a meeting between statesmen. It was a truce between adversaries. Truman tried to stick to his duty. He explained the daily flow of intelligence, how budget submissions worked, how cabinet meetings were structured. He walked through the rhythms of the office, the side of presidential leadership you only understood by living it. But Eisenhower, confident from a lifetime of command, felt the explanations were unnecessary. He listened politely, yet his body language was unmistakable. He believed he already knew how to run an organization. The final blow came when Truman shifted the conversation to foreign policy. The Cold War was entering a new and dangerous phase. Europe was fragile, Stalin unpredictable, and Korea still burning. Yet Eisenhower, who had commanded NATO and dealt personally with world leaders, appeared uninterested in Truman's warnings. When he later wrote that the meeting added little to my knowledge, Truman felt that dismissal like a slap. After Eisenhower left, Truman vented to his staff with a mixture of sadness and exasperation. "Poor Ike," he said. "He'll sit right here and say do this, do that, and nothing will happen. It's not the army." It was not an insult. Truman genuinely believed Ike would struggle with the messy, political, negotiation-based reality of presidential power. If anything, Truman feared the job would frustrate the general who once commanded millions with a signature and a sentence. But the real explosion was still ahead. Because when Inauguration Day arrived, Eisenhower made a decision so cold and so deliberate that the world would see their feud in one unforgettable moment. January 20th, 1953 dawned gray and heavy, the kind of morning where the cold carries a quiet warning. Tradition dictated that the president-elect would enter the White House, share coffee with the outgoing president and first lady, then ride together to the Capitol. But as the limousine rolled to a stop outside the north portico, Dwight Eisenhower stayed inside the car, motionless. He made no move toward the door. No aide approached. No gesture signaled hesitation. Eisenhower wasn't late, he was refusing. Inside the executive mansion, Harry Truman stood by a tall window, watching the stalled car through the glass. He understood instantly what was happening. It was a deliberate break with one of the nation's most symbolic customs. Truman had endured months of campaign insults, political slights, and personal wounds, but he had still expected Eisenhower to honor the ceremony of transition. Yet the general refused to cross the threshold of Truman's White House, as if setting foot inside would grant legitimacy to a man he now viewed with open disdain. For a brief, tense moment, it seemed the impasse might halt the inauguration itself. Inside, staff whispered. Outside, reporters sensed something unusual was unfolding. But Truman, for all his anger, remembered the institution he served. He walked to the portico, stepped into the cold morning air, and approached the waiting limousine. Eisenhower did not step out to greet him, so Truman opened the door and climbed in, an outgoing president forced to enter the president-elect's car like an unwelcome passenger. The two men sat side by side in profound silence. They didn't look at each other. They didn't exchange greetings. The city outside roared with celebration, but inside the car the mood was glacial. Mamie Eisenhower tried to break the ice with small comments, noting the crowds lining the avenue. Truman offered polite nods, neither warm nor hostile, just hollow. Years of disappointment hung between the two men, thick as fog. Then Eisenhower finally spoke, not to address Truman, not to acknowledge the moment, but to ask who had ordered his son John home from the Korean front lines. The question floated heavily in the cramped space. Truman answered calmly, "I did." He explained that he believed Eisenhower's son deserved to witness his father take the oath of office. It was a quiet act of decency. But Eisenhower offered no thank you, no nod of recognition, nothing. He simply turned back to the window. The silence returned, heavier than before. But the bitterness didn't end that day. For years, the two titans of American history refused to speak, until a funeral forced them into the same room, and grief did what politics could not. After the awkward, frozen car ride and the solemn inauguration, Truman left Washington with a mix of relief and heartbreak. He boarded the train home to Independence, Missouri, greeted by thousands of cheering citizens who lined the station to welcome him back. Eisenhower, meanwhile, settled into the White House, beginning 8 years of leadership without once inviting Truman through its doors. Not for dinners, not for ceremonies, not for anything. A decade of silence stretched between them. Two men tied by history yet severed by pride. Eisenhower sent invitations occasionally, formal, polite, distant. Truman turned them down each time. To the former president, the invitations felt perfunctory, like attempts to repair the public image of a feud rather than the relationship itself. Meanwhile, Eisenhower believed Truman's refusal was petty. They lived like two states in Cold War. No communication, no reconciliation, only parallel lives shadowed by unresolved anger. Then, in October 1959, fate intervened. George C. Marshall, the man who had unknowingly become the fault line between Truman and Eisenhower, died at Walter Reed Hospital. For the first time since 1953, the two men were forced into the same room. At Fort Myer Chapel, they sat side by side in the same pew, united in grief yet separated by years of bitterness. Neither spoke, neither reached out. They simply stared ahead at the coffin of the man whose integrity had once bound them together. Death brought them together again and again. Chief Justice Fred Vinson passed. Eleanor Roosevelt passed. Speaker Sam Rayburn passed. Each funeral placed them within feet of one another. At every service, they exchanged polite nods but no words. It was as if both men were waiting for the other to break the silence first. Yet neither would surrender the ground they believed they were owed. Then came November 22, 1963. President John F. Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas, plunging the nation into mourning. Former presidents from both parties flew to Washington. During the funeral procession to Arlington, Truman and Eisenhower found themselves once again in the same car. This time, the conversation came naturally. They spoke of the assassination, of the world's uncertainties, of the weight of leadership. For the first time in a decade, they weren't adversaries. They were two old warriors wounded by tragedy. After 10 years of silence, grief finally softened their defenses. But the true reconciliation, the moment the feud finally melted, came over a simple lunch of sandwiches and coffee. After Kennedy's graveside service, as world leaders dispersed and the nation grieved, something unexpected happened. Margaret Truman gently invited the Eisenhowers to join her father at Blair House, where the Trumans were staying. Eisenhower agreed. For the first time since the icy limousine ride of 1953, the two former presidents would sit together. Not on a stage, not at a funeral, but at a small table with coffee, sandwiches, and no cameras. What followed wasn't dramatic. It wasn't scripted. It was simply human. The conversation drifted naturally. Two elderly men reminiscing about battles fought, crises survived, and mistakes made along the way. They talked about Europe, about the early days of the Cold War, about victories that had been celebrated and failures that still haunted them. Observers later said it felt like watching two old friends rediscover a familiar rhythm, as if time had sanded down the sharp edges of their feud. For a moment, neither man was the aggrieved veteran of 1952. They were simply Harry and Ike. When lunch ended, Truman and Margaret walked the Eisenhowers out to their car. There, on the sidewalk, came the gesture that symbolized what a decade of silence could not destroy: a long, quiet handshake. Truman held Eisenhower's hand for an extra moment, as if acknowledging all the years lost to anger. Eisenhower returned the grip with equal sincerity. No one spoke. They didn't need to. The handshake itself was an apology, a farewell, and a reconciliation all in one breath. They met only once more, at a United Nations luncheon in Kansas City in 1966. Eisenhower's brother Milton said it best. All the old animosities were forgotten. The two men laughed, reminisced, and talked like soldiers who had survived the same war. A few years later, Eisenhower died in March 1969. Truman died 3 years after him, in December 1972. Their lives had been intertwined from Europe's battlefields to America's political battlegrounds, their rivalry ultimately ending in mutual respect. The story of their conflict, and the silent limousine outside the White House, became part of American political legend. It stands as a reminder that even great leaders are vulnerable to pride, emotion, and wounded loyalty. Truman embodied duty when he stepped into that cold January air to greet a man who refused to enter his house. Eisenhower embodied conviction, even if flawed, when he chose silence over conflict in a turbulent campaign. Their reconciliation a decade later showed something deeper. Time can heal what politics shatters. History remembers presidents for wars won, economies strengthened, and laws passed. But sometimes, the most revealing moment is simply a threshold, and the choice of whether to cross it.